I'm just going to read my paper. Not too accustomed to public speaking, so, right? The anarchist dream has a long history. Anyone who has been repulsed by the master-slave dialectic can identify with its call to freedom. Shelley's words resound in our ears. The man of virtuous soul commands not nor obeys. Power, like a desolating pestilence, pollutes whate'er it touches, and obedience, bane of all genius, virtue, freedom, truth, makes slaves of men, and of the human frame a mechanized automaton. But the charge of utopianism sticks to the anarchist ideal like glue. What solvent is capable of loosening this bond? One retains a strong skepticism of models such as that of Kropotkin, which basically posit that the removal of oppressive social structures will, in and of itself, lead to widespread voluntary cooperation. Some other obstacle must be preventing us from reaching a state of mind which is inclined toward cooperation. At this point, the question becomes, what are the real chains of humanity? The history of communism and other modes of social organization constituted in opposition to capitalism in the last 150 years strongly suggests that they are not to be found at the level of the institution, but in our own individual psyches. This anarcho-psychological critique of human experience has its roots in the intellectual ferment informing the French Revolution and its aftermath. The point of view of this critique, the principle probably focused on, is the liberal rationalist tradition. Political liberalism takes as its starting point the freedom and autonomy of the individual, but at this late remove, one comes to the inescapable conclusion that there exists a dark underside to the liberal project, which is unappreciated by its proponents. For liberalism's claim to universal applicability can only exist through exclusion. Against its ostensible objectives, it favors a certain type of individual over others, and this favoritism has a strong odor of the arbitrary. It has favored, specifically, white male Protestant landowners with rigid and lugubrious dispositional tendencies derived from their Calvinist roots. Adjustments to this paradigm made in the 19th and 20th centuries have been anything but fundamental. Even 100 years ago, the social theorist Max Weber saw that the light cloak of the Protestant Christian ideal had become an iron cage. Capitalist and worker alike are held in its pervasive thrall. It won't do to merely redistribute wealth or even obviate the capitalist-worker dynamic. One is instead dealing with nothing less than a deep internalization on the individual level of the structures of patriarchal authority. As the radical psychologist Otto Gross put it, about whom I will speak again further on, quote, "Whoever wants to change the structures of power and production in a repressive society has to start by changing these structures in himself and to eradicate the authority that has infiltrated one's own inner being." How does one get at these deeply rooted psychic structures? Sigmund Freud provided an answer that has had a profound influence on psychology, discovered as he formulated his theory of neurosis in the course of his early clinical practice. The study of the unconscious was in effect forced on Freud by the neurotic syndromes presented by his patients, characterized by a selective forgetting of traumatic events from childhood Freud termed repression. This lapse of memory was revealed to have a scope that no one before him had anticipated, and illuminated a troubling but ultimately liberating conception of psychic motivation. The consequences of this theory revealed a striking parallel. The repressed contents of the individual mind resembles nothing so much as a maximum security prison, holding antisocial inmates who are treated with wildly excessive harshness and require hyper-aggressive guards to keep order. Despite all precautions, these inmates do sometimes escape, often causing considerable damage in the process to both the jailer and those on the outside. The danger in confronting these forces is all too obvious. The character and scope of Freud's patient's problems was, however, a strong motivator to press on. "I did this," says my memory. "I cannot have done this," says my pride, and remains inexorable. In the end, memory yields. Friedrich Nietzsche's famous phrasing was well known to Freud, who apparently found it to be an apt description of unconscious dynamics. Freud's latter-day biographer, Peter Gay, draws out some interesting implications in his discussion of repression in Freud's theory. "Pride is the constraining hand of culture," he says. "Memory, the report on desire in thought and action. It may be that pride wins out, but desire remains humanity's most exigent quality. Desire, that explosive force which has been the bane of all lawmakers and moralists for millennia, and the inspiration of poets from Sappho to the Surrealists, calls us ever onward. One has the temerity at such a juncture to assert that the recovery of the unconscious is the mechanism through which the rehabilitation of desire can be effected. The drive to make the unconscious conscious has been building for a long time, but it wasn't until the appearance of Max Stirner as the ego and its own in 1844 that the scope of the hidden motivations of the psyche found their way to expression in a philosophical context. Stirner arrives at his idea of the untrammeled self principally by way of his critique of what blocks it, focusing his destructive gaze with a special fervor on the concept of morality. It wasn't enough to dispose of God as such in one's quest to rid oneself of psychic delusion. One had to address the question of God's office, or as Stirner puts it, the controlling power of the idea of the highest essence. Stirner is unsparing in his critique of the power of the religious impulse. Quote, "Take notice of how a moral man behaves, who today often thinks he is through with God and throws off Christianity as a bygone thing. If you ask him whether he has ever doubted that the copulation of brother and sister is incest, that monogamy is the truth of marriage, that filial piety is a sacred duty, then a moral shudder will come over him at the conception of one's being allowed to touch his sister as wife also. And whence this shudder? Because he believes in those moral commandments. This moral faith is deeply rooted in his breast." Unquote. If the escape from religion is your goal, you who call yourself moderns, challenges Stirner, morality must fall by the wayside as well, because they are two sides of the same coin. Elsewhere, Stirner connects morality to the self-extinguishment of humiliation. Quote, "Moral influence takes its start where humiliation begins. Yes, it is nothing else than this humiliation itself, the breaking and bending of the temper down to humility. If I call to someone to run away when a rock is to be blasted, I exert no moral influence by this demand. If I say to a child, 'You will go hungry if you will not eat what is put on the table,' this is not moral influence. But if I say to the child, 'You will pray, honor your parents, respect the crucifix, speak the truth, for this belongs to man and is man's calling,' or even, 'This is God's will,' then moral influence is complete. Then a man is to bend before the calling of man, be tractable, become humble, give up his will for an alien one which is set up as rule and law. He is to abase himself before something higher, self-abasement. He that abaseth himself shall be exalted." Unquote. The conflict between individual and social needs forms the basis of Stirner's critique. Freud, of course, was keenly aware of this conflict, but, in contradistinction to Stirner, took the side of civilization, or as he put it, of the need to submit to the reality principle. In Freud's view, to gain insight into the dark world of the psyche, repression must be struggled against, but it must not be done at the cost of the general weakening of the pillars of civilization. But is it really in the interest of individual psychic health to unearth these repressed memories, only to insist that the dynamic forces released as a result must not threaten the functioning of civilization rooted in the law of the Father? It is here where the materialist critique of psychology finds its starting point. The idealization of experience, a fate all too familiar to the inhabitants of all cultures based on psychic repression, is inevitable without a convincing refutation of Freud's conception of the reality principle. Instead,